This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work, responding to another Ask Prof. Wolff question from our Patreon community. This question comes from Lawson Adams and has to do with China. Excuse me. The question Lawson Adams asks concerns defense spending by China. There is a famous statistics that circulates around the world, except in the United States where it doesn't circulate very much, that compares the dollar outlay of the United States on defense, somewhere between $700 billion and $1 trillion a year these days, and what other countries spend. And it concludes that the United States spends more than 8 or 9 other countries in order of importance. That is, the United States ranks number 1, and the next 8 or 9 countries together don't spend as much as the United States. And those other 8 or 9 countries include not only Russia and China, but other countries that are all considered allies of the United States. In other words, it is clear that spending on military activity is an outsized American phenomena compared to which the rest of the world is really a distant competitor. So along comes the Army Chief of Staff here in the United States and other high officials of the military who are constantly confronted, at least abroad, and by a few critics at home, by the fact that the United States is outspending everybody else. But remember that what the government spends on military is the budget with which the military chiefs play. That's their money to spend. That's what covers all of the perks of the military around the world. So they have a problem. How are you going to keep getting your budget higher and higher, which is what the leaders are mostly given to do, when you are already spending so much relative to anybody who could possibly bother you militarily? The answer has been to come up with an excuse, which is what this is. You decide to measure things differently. The measurement used to show that the United States outspends everybody is to simply use exchange rates. Whatever the US dollar is worth in so many Japanese or Chinese or French or Russian currency is then used to measure what's the dollar equivalent of what they're spending. But there are, of course, in the history of international economics, debates and disputes about what is the appropriate way to measure. And in some cases, and for some purposes, an alternative measure has been used. It's called Purchasing Power Parity. That is, you adjust the amounts to take into account that money has a different meaning, a different ability to buy things in different countries. And that is not entirely captured by exchange rates. Now, it is true that China is more connected to the rest of the world now than at any other time since the communist revolution there in 1949. It is therefore more appropriate now to use exchange rates, but then again, that's not what the military want. So, what is the actual difference? Well, my sense is, and I think most international economists would agree, that you use mixtures of measures when there are pros and cons to any one of them. So you might want to increase a bit the amount of spending that you attribute to other countries to take account of the different purchasing power inside those countries that their money has. But the ideas floated by the American military that if you do this, you might even come up with a military budget bigger in China than what we have in this country, should be understood for what it is. Special pleading, coming up with some kind of argument to justify what has been, at least for the few who know, an embarrassment in American history and American economics, namely the absurd overspending of the American military, not only during the Cold War, but particularly after the Cold War was over and the enmity of the Soviet Union was gone because the Soviet Union was. It is important to understand that the bashing of Mr. Putin in Russia, the bashing of the Chinese, a plaything, a pastime for leaders of both the Republican and Democratic parties, is exactly the same non-serious rhetorical politics that the military chiefs doing real wonderful moves on Chinese statistics in order to justify the rising military budget or to justify distracting the American people from the real problems they face at home by focusing them on threats exaggerated abroad. That's not only an American phenomena, of course, it's a tried and true method for governments in trouble all around the world. But we should not ever imagine that we in the United States are somehow exempt from the exact same political shenanigans. This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work.